All right. Then I'd like to introduce my colleague, Paul Locke, who's the Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup. Paul?
Okay, thank you, Leldon.
Sorry, we did just get a question, but I think we might just hold that to the end.
Okay.
Okay, this is Paul Locke, and as mentioned, I'm the Assistant Commissioner for the Waste Site Cleanup Program. And you may be asking, why are we talking about the MCP? So next slide, please. Oh, there we go, that's why. And I think it's partly because we in the Waste Site Cleanup Program have already been through a standard setting process. As Stephanie mentioned at the beginning, the Waste Site Cleanup Program promulgated notification criteria and cleanup standards for PFAS in soil and groundwater back in December of last year. So we thought it might be useful and helpful for people to hear how one DEP program can balance the different factors that go into the standard setting process. Often these are conflicting factors and thus need to balance. And it's also good to point out that the science surrounding PFAS continues to evolve and it changes quickly, so that the information available now that you will be considering in the coming months may be different from what we were looking back in 2019. Again, something that may affect the balance of how these pieces are put together. I'd like to underscore, of course, that we know and you know that residuals are not soil. And the Waste Site Cleanup Program is not the residuals program, and that different programs may make different choices as they weigh the different factors that go into the standard setting process. But it might be useful and informative to go over how the Waste Site Cleanup Program kind of went through this thought process. So next slide, please. This is a 50,000 foot overview of our standard setting process. And this has been in place since 1993. And all of the MCP cleanup standards, the soil standards, go through this same kind of process. It's not unique to PFAS, to be clear. The other thing is there's a link here that leads to a longer than I'm going to talk now, but still relatively short YouTube video that goes into a lot of detail on each of these factors and how they were put together. So if you're really interested in this, please click on that and take a look at those videos, and feel free to send in email questions if you have any, at any point that you had a chance to look at that. Overall, there are 6 factors that are taken into account for PFAS. Well, 6 factors taken into account in the standard setting process. For PFAS, it actually comes down to 5 because we're not at the point yet where we're calculating cancer risk-based concentrations. And a couple of these tend to drive the cleanup standards lower. And some of these provide bounds on how high or how low these generic standards can be calculated. So we have the non-cancer risk-based concentration, which looks at exposure, how people, particularly children for our S1 standards, come into contact with soil, how frequently, how long, how much soil is ingested, any potential dermal contact effects. We looked at the potential for leaching from the soil to groundwater and how it might affect the underlying groundwater. And we have 3 different kinds of groundwater, 3 different categories that we take into account. We have sealing concentration, which is one of the boundary options. It's a limit on how high these generic standards might be calculated. And we also take into account background, because in the Waste Site Cleanup Program, we want to make sure that the cleanup standards that we're setting are not below either natural or anthropogenic background that might be out there. We're in the business of cleaning up releases from sites, and our authority doesn't include cleaning up background to even lower levels. And we want to make sure that our standards are measurable. So we take into account the analytical detection limit. And so we balance these factors in the way that's described here, taking the lowest of some, the highest of others, to come up with the method 1 soil standards that we see promulgated in the regulations. So next slide, please. So one of the factors that you may look at in different programs may evaluate differently are things like background. In the Wayside Cleanup Program, back in 1993, after extensive discussion and consideration, the program chose to always look at the 90th percentile from whatever data set is, from the data sets that are available and deemed appropriate for background conditions, because we're balancing the need for notification, identifying sites, and how far we can go to clean up to or beyond background. But different programs may look at that differently. So for instance, for PFAS, we looked at what at the time was a recent background study that the state of Vermont had commissioned, looking at superficial soil levels of PFAS. And that study looked at a large number of samples, superficial soil samples, and the data was sufficient to look at and describe the range and the variability of the different specific PFAS compounds across the state. And so you can look at that data set, and we identified the 90th percentile value, but this slide here demonstrates or shows you the 50th percentile value as well, simply to note that there is variability, obviously, within any of these background data sets, and where you choose a value depends upon the different goals of the program and what they're trying to achieve. So I hope you click on the link that was in the previous slide. If you have any questions about how these standards were developed or kind of the thought process that went into them, feel free to send along questions. We have a lot of information available. We try to have a very transparent process and with a lot of help from our stakeholders, much like you are providing help for the residual numbers. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jennifer, I believe.